Ladies and gentlemen, in order to achieve an R rating today, a motion picture must contain full frontal nudity, graphic violence, or an explicit reference to the sex act. Since this film has none of those, and since research has proven that R-rated films are by far the most popular with the movie-going public, the producers of this motion picture have asked me to take this opportunity to say, fuck you.
I couldn't resist. Hey guys, welcome to Priceless B-Movies. Today, instead of doing a review, I'm going to try something a little different. There's something that's been weighing very heavily on my mind these days with horror movies, and even more so back in the late 80s and early 90s, which is the kind of stuff I like to watch and review anyway, which is the MPAA and how full of crap they are. Growing up here in Champaign, I used to love going to the video store, especially in the 90s, because there were video stores all over Champaign. There had to have been 10 or 11 video stores in this one town. It was great, but the one thing that really pissed me off is if I would see a movie on TV and think, man, this is a great movie, I want to see this again. Then I'd rush to the video store and I'd get hit with the fact that the movie was rated R. I'd look back on what I watched and be like, how could that have gotten an R rating? I don't understand. I mean, when being a child, I didn't understand the concept of something being edited for television necessarily. I just figured that that was the movie that I had just watched. I didn't quite get the concept of tampering with it to make it suitable for television. That's one thing that pisses me off when I think back to my childhood. But the thing that pisses me off even more is to have later on in life seen the film in its R-rated version and be sitting there thinking, what was even taken out of that for TV? What was so horrible about this movie that it got an R rating? It's not like I'm watching Natural Born Killers here. Well, when you think about it, let's see. When I was a kid and seeing movies on TV like that, it was the early to mid-90s, which means that the movies airing on television from the late 80s, early 90s were the same horror and slasher and action films that the MPAA had just started butchering. You see, after the slew of slasher movies really took over the horror genre in the 80s, by the end of that decade, the MPAA and certain critical organizations were just sick of horror and sick of slasher movies. And they figured by slapping an R rating on something, that would mean that fewer people would see it and it wouldn't make as much money. Yeah, I know, they're very stupid. But this resulted in a lot of movies around that time being released with an R rating that, at least in my opinion, shouldn't have. If they were remade shot for shot today, they would be PG-13 or lower. Now here's the thing. With these films that I've picked, please remember that this is my opinion. And I'm not going to say, oh, Candyman shouldn't have gotten an R. Hellraiser shouldn't have gotten an R. If it's a movie that's pretty generally regarded by the public as an adult R-rated horror film that deserves that rating, I'm going to try to avoid it. These are the movies that I think aren't bad enough for the rating that they got. But once again, that means it's my opinion. I know other people aren't going to share my opinion necessarily, but that's why they call this the internet. That's what we do, share our opinions. First movie on my list, number 10, is a movie called 976 Evil. This is a movie that was the directorial debut of Robert Englund, who you all might know as Freddy Krueger. I've also mentioned him before in one or two of my reviews. If you don't know who Freddy Krueger is, why are you watching these videos? Get up out of your chair and out of from the rock you're under and go to a video store. Anyway, the movie stars Stephen Jeffries of Fright Night fame, and this movie, just like in Fright Night, he kind of plays this dorky character who's just got no luck. He's basically Finch from American Pie. And he ends up coming across an advertisement for a horoscope hotline. He thinks it's kind of stupid and harmless fun at first, but he starts following the advice every time he calls this hotline, and this being on the other end starts to slowly possess him and turn him into a demon. That's basically the premise for this film. The film got an R rating, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it, but in my research, I was unable to find out the MPAA actual rating, like the content-wise, why they rated it R. You notice on a lot of films, especially today, it'll say rated R for violence, sex, language, whatever. The gist of why they gave it that rating. Couldn't find that information for 976 Evil, but if I had to take a guess, I would basically say it's for violence, it's for language, it's for a very brief sex scene in the film. The only thing that I think actually tipped this movie into the R rating is literally one scene where a character's hand is cut off in close-up, and then later on another character is shown holding two human hearts that he had supposedly just ripped out of two people. Parts of this sequence are shown in images that are on the back cover of the DVD case and the VHS case, I believe. So I'm not quite sure if they decided that it was okay to advertise pictures of this for anyone who wanted to pick up the DVD cover and look at the back of the case, then I'm not quite sure why they felt that it deserved the R rating. I know some people will argue with me on this one, and that's why it's at number 10. Coming in at number 9 is Needful Things. It's a miniseries based off of a story by Stephen King. Stephen King obviously had to get on this list somehow. Needful Things is about a stranger who moves into this small town. This will a lot of Stephen King stories start with. And he opens this kind of antique / curio / pawn shop and ends up trading objects, material possessions for the townsfolk in exchange for these kind of sinful favors that he asks of them. By halfway through the movie, you figure out that this guy is supposed to be the devil disguised as a human who is buying these people's souls for these material possessions. While being a nice metaphor for how transfixed us people are about just collecting everything that you possibly can, the movie got an R rating, which is weird. It got an R rating for violence and strong language. This was a miniseries. This was a miniseries on primetime television. The movie has an R rating. When I say the movie, I mean the DVD version has an R rating, but it is condensed. It is not the entire miniseries. My question is, if this is a miniseries and it's condensed, it's not even everything that was shown on primetime. All that's different is that there's a few more fucks thrown in, and there's maybe, I don't even think that, I think that's it. I think there's just a little more bad language in it. That earned it the R rating. From what I understand, there's a Blu-ray of the film coming that's supposed to be the entire miniseries as it aired on television, which of course, from what I understand, is going to have a PG-13 rating. So, I don't know, maybe in the future people will realize how dumb it was to try to give this DVD an R. At number 8, we've got another television-related film, Tales from the Darkside, the movie. This is another movie that I wasn't able to find the MPAA's actual notes on, but I would assume that, you know, it's for overall just some sex, some violence, some language. The thing that strikes me about Tales from the Darkside, the movie, is that while it does have some violence, while it does have some language, and while it does have some sexual content, none of it really pushes any boundaries. All of these were written to be a film based off of a television anthology show. So, if the television show is rated TV-PG in reruns, you've got to think that the segments in this movie aren't going to be extremely bloody or extremely horrific. They're just meant to go along with a TV-PG TV show. I think that what happened here was the MPAA decided that it's not just one episode of the show at a time. This is 3 segments of horror stuffed into one, and then it was probably quantity over quality, and that's why it got the R. That's my only guess, because I really don't understand any other reason why this would have gotten an R rating. But it did. Taking the number 7 spot on my list, taking a bite out of number 7, yeah, I know, I'm full of puns today, is Wolf. Wolf, starring Jack Nicholson, Michelle Pfeiffer, and James Spader. James Spader isn't in that much of the movie, but since Avengers came out and no one will shut up about James Spader on Facebook, I may as well throw my little bit about him onto YouTube. This movie is about Jack Nicholson. He is just kind of an everyman, a middle-aged everyman. He works as the chief editor for this publishing house, and he's kind of battling inter-office politics, as well as the fact that he's turning into a freaking werewolf. Now, the MPAA gave Wolf the R rating for language and what they say, language and werewolf attacks. Not werewolf violence, not werewolf gore. Werewolf attacks. Now, if you look at some other werewolf movies like The Howling or American Werewolf in London or Ginger Snaps, or most werewolf movies are pretty considerably violent. They're pretty considerably gory, at least in certain parts of the film. Wolf, to the best of my recollection, and I have seen the movie a few times, most of the werewolf attacks, in fact almost all of them, take place off-screen or are suggested. I think the only real violent scene is a battle between two werewolves at the end of the movie, but even that is more kind of based in action than in horror. Language-wise, there is some profanity, but honestly, I think profanity is kind of a dumb reason to give a movie an R rating, especially if it's a horror movie and the first thing you cite is language. Let's face it, what are you protecting your kids from? A 10-year-old hears much worse stuff than this at school than they're going to hear by watching Wolf. Coming in at number 6 is a movie that I actually did a review for on this page a little while ago called Popcorn. If you want to know what that movie's about, really just watch my review. I don't want to really talk about the movie and its plot twice inside of a couple of weeks. That seems kind of futile to me. According to the MPAA, Popcorn got its R rating for what they say strong violence and language. In my review of Popcorn, I point out how tame the violence is. Other than maybe 2 scenes, there's no blood in the movie. None. There's no sex in the movie at all. Profanity-wise, I'm sure there's some because they listed it as a reason for the rating. I don't even readily recall one F-bomb in that entire movie. I think other than an impaling and one real quick shot of skin coming off of a person that literally lasts 2 seconds, there is no gore in this film. I have no idea what the R rating is about on this. I really do think this is a movie that the MPAA just had it out for. Okay, here we are at the halfway point. At number 5, I have a movie that I have yet to review but mean to, called Highway to Hell. Highway to Hell was made in the early 90s, stars Rob Lowe's little brother Chad Lowe as a guy who's about to elope with his girlfriend slash fiance. You know this whole story. Romeo meets Juliet and takes her to Vegas to get married. You know, I'm sure that's not exactly how Romeo and Juliet turns out, but that's the premise of this film. Unfortunately, they take a detour in the desert, and long story short, she gets kidnapped and taken to hell, and he has to go in and get her. The MPAA rating for Highway to Hell makes me laugh. Their rating actually states, rated R for bizarre fantasy violence and for nudity. For a movie about a guy having to go into hell to save his girlfriend, you'd expect one really disturbing, disgusting movie. But the movie is actually played more as an action comedy than a horror film. Bizarre fantasy violence. Define bizarre fantasy violence. So what, like sword and sorcery stuff? Or just random, you know what? There's next to no gore in this movie. The violence is extremely video game-ish in nature. And the nudity, yeah, there's like one 4 to 5 second shot of boobs in this movie, and they thought that that was enough to slap an R rating on it. This movie is a comedy that not a lot of people know about, but people should really look into. There's a lot of cool cameos in this, including one from Ben Stiller, and honestly, I think that slapping an R rating on it was really just kind of a fuck you to the filmmakers. Number 4 on my list is another movie, kind of like 976 Evil, that some people might disagree with me on, but I really do feel that I can put this at number 4 on my list. Warlock. Warlock stars Julian Sands, and this is, like Wolf, a more well-known movie than some of the other films on this list. If you don't know what it is, though, I'll give you the gist. Basically, Julian Sands is a warlock who is about to stand trial for crimes of witchcraft, and the witch hunter who caught him, played by Richard E. Grant, gets caught up with Julian Sands as he is creating a spell that will throw him into the future so he can escape his trial. But Richard E. Grant gets caught with him, and so now they're in present-day Los Angeles duking it out. Basically, this is the Terminator with sorcery instead of cyborgs. Unfortunately, Warlock is another movie that I was unable to dig up the actual content rating for. So it is rated R, and I would assume that they would just put, like I said, violence, language, Language, I don't remember any language in this movie. Sex, I don't remember any at all. Now, violence is one that you could easily hit this movie for. It's a horror movie. And there are some, violent ideas. But almost all the worst things in this movie happen off screen. There's one sequence I remember where a character has their tongue bit out and spit onto a table, and you can see it for a couple of seconds. You see worse than that in the Mummy movies. I have no idea why this is R. I would like to remind people that I'm talking about the first Warlock in 1989. It does have a sequel called Warlock Armageddon that is much more violent, much bloodier, and much more deserving of the R rating than the first film is. Number 3 is another movie that I'm sure a few people out there probably know about. It's called The Lawnmower Man. It was made in 1992 and stars Pierce Brosnan a couple years before he became famous to everyone as James Bond. Pierce Brosnan in this film is a scientist who is trying to figure out how virtual reality can enable the human brain, can make someone smarter, can make our minds evolve. If that doesn't sound weird enough for you, he decides that the perfect test subject for this is a slow-minded lawnmower man played by Jeff Fahey. Now, without getting too much more into the plot, because this is a movie that you've either seen, or if you haven't seen, I don't want to tell you any more about it. Without getting too much into the plot, this movie has an R rating, the MPAA says, for language, sensuality, and a scene of violence. Is there bad language in this movie? Yeah, there is, not gonna lie. But it's pretty moderate. I think it's pretty much up to par with what you find in a PG-13 movie today. Sensuality, I don't even really know where they get that one from. There's some dialogue where a couple of people describe one of the girls who lives in the neighborhood as being hot, basically your average Stifler's mom kind of conversation. Nothing that I would think pushes the boundaries of a PG-13. For the scene of violence, I'm not even sure what scene they're referring to. There's definitely some weird scenes in this movie, but it's kind of hard to figure out which one they saw and went, oh, no, that's violent. We have to mention that one. Everything is kind of done with this weird visual effect. The sensual sequence in the film, there is a lovemaking sequence, it's done and shown in a virtual reality kind of way, so it's almost like watching two Sims go at it. There's nothing very detailed about it at all, and the violence is kind of the same way. The violence is very CG, the violence is very, just honestly non-existent. It's like watching characters die in a video game that was made circa 95. There's no blood, and it looks extraordinarily fake. Why this film has an R rating has to be because it was based off a short story by Stephen King, and the MPA just went, well, we can't have that, it's Stephen King, it's got to get an R rating. The ironic thing is that Stephen King actually took the makers of The Lawnmower Man to court because their movie had nothing to do with his story. Alright, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty here. We got 2 more movies. At number 2, I'm going to throw the film Blind Fury at you. Blind Fury has Rutger Hauer playing a Vietnam vet who is stricken blind, and he basically walks softly and carries a big freaking sword. This guy is blind, but he's kind of the blind ninja. There's a lot of sword play, and he goes on this revenge mission to avenge a friend of his who was killed. Blind Fury is not a horror movie, but it is one of the action films that were kind of casualty of the MPA throwing harsh ratings at things. Now, watching Blind Fury again, and the last time I did was a while ago, I actually consulted the internet to see what other people remembered of this, and ended up watching segments of it so I could kind of remember what the content was. The MPAA, again on this one, does not list their reason for giving it a rating, and honestly, I can't imagine what their reason for giving it a rating is. There is sword play, there are some people who are shot and stabbed, there's no blood, there's very little blood at least. Let me put it to you this way. There are only 3 F words in this movie. You know what other movie only has 3 F words in it? As Good as It Gets, but that came out in 1998 with a PG-13 rating. In addition to that, the most violent thing that happens in this movie, there's a guy who gets cut in half, no blood, and you see him falling, and as he's falling you see the two halves of him separate. You know what other movie did that? Star Wars, A Phantom Menace, got a PG rating. Why the hell is Blind Fury rated R? Alright, drum roll please, the number 1 R-rated film that does not deserve the R rating. Army of Darkness. Army of Darkness came out in 1992 and is the 3rd installment of the Evil Dead trilogy. You will never, ever, ever hear me say that Evil Dead's 1 and 2 don't deserve their R ratings. They do. They are grisly, they are over the top, not a scene goes by in part 2 that doesn't warrant an R rating in and of itself. But I do think that that's why Army of Darkness has an R rating. Army of Darkness is incredibly tame when you compare it to the previous 2 films. This is more of a slapstick comedy than anything else. There's next to no blood except for one shot of a hole in the ground and a geyser of very obviously fake blood shooting out, and it's all this kind of demonic fantasy comedy tone to it. Other than that, there's no blood in this entire movie. There is no sex in this entire movie. There is 1 F word in the film. Back in about 95, 96, I remember seeing Army of Darkness for the first time play on USA. USA, if you guys remember back in the 90s, they were quick to edit out anything they could. They were kind of a more family-friendly network. But you know what? I swear to you, I have seen Army of Darkness on TV so many times. I have seen it on DVD so many times. The only thing in the entire movie that they ever cut out of television is the 1 F word. If that's the only thing that's bad enough for them to take out of showing it on TV with a TV PG rating, then that tells me this should have been PG, or PG-13 at the most. There are some scary parts of it, I guess, if you're 3, but this is, as I said, much more of a Three Stooges film than an Evil Dead film. This really has to be the MPAA just went, well, the first 2 were really horrible, so we'll just follow suit and give this one an R and no one will even notice. Completely absurd and completely unwarranted. So there it is. That's my list of 10 movies that got an R rating that I think is complete bullshit. I am thinking of doing a list sometime further down the road where I intend to do the opposite. We have a list of 15 PG-13 movies that probably should have gotten an R rating. As I said, these are my personal opinion, and ratings will always be subjective. There will always be people who disagree with them. There are a lot of mainstream movies that are rated R that I don't think should be. I don't think A Few Good Men should be rated R. I don't think The Conjuring should be rated R. But those are, more mainstream, and for these lists, I am trying my best to stick to movies that aren't discussed much or that are overlooked. Obviously, I've got some more reviews coming for you guys as well, but this is something I really wanted to put to video and give out my opinion on, because as I said, it's been really bothering me lately. Is there an R-rated movie from the late 80s, early 90s that you think has a completely unjustified rating? Let me know in the comments section. Who knows, I'll probably agree with you. I'm actually pretty relaxed. I'm not a prude in any way, but I think that if you're going to give an R rating to something, at least let it be an actual R-rated film. As always, thank you for watching, and please stay tuned for more Priceless B movies.